Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to express my appreciation to the university and to Dr. Bach for inviting me here today to talk about marijuana as a health hazard. I'm sorry that I didn't have the opportunity of listening to the seminar from beginning to end, and I'm afraid I won't even be able to stay later this afternoon. But I am delighted to be here to talk about the problem because we feel in talking with you people in the educational field, we can do much to solve the problems of drug abuse. I'm in the control aspect of the program. I'm with law enforcement, and I presume you'd consider the control aspect of law enforcement and the treatment with the medical community, and then the rehabilitation area after the medical community is finished with the treatment. But we found, and we're finding, that this is not the sole answer to the problem of drug abuse. There's another important aspect to controlling the problem, and that's really in the area of prevention. So in the area of prevention, we need a great deal of research, and we need a great deal of more education. And we're hoping through programs like this that you get a much broader aspect of the whole drug abuse problem. And not only getting an aspect of it, but get equipped with facts. And as a result of getting these facts, you can pass them on to your colleagues and to the students. Bill mentioned about this reorganization. I'd like to tell you very briefly just where the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs stands at the moment. We're a federal agency, and originally I was in the Bureau of Narcotics, and it was with the Treasury Department, U.S. Treasury Department, and it was one of a number of enforcement agencies in the Treasury Department. And we handled drugs such as heroin, morphine, marijuana, cocaine, and a number of other opiate derivatives. There was another federal agency called the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control, a fairly recent agency. It's out of the Food and Drug Administration. And this agency, for the past few years, has been handling drugs such as the amphetamines and the barbiturates, LSD. And it seemed that we were compartmentalizing the drug problem. We were handling what might be termed hard drugs. They were handling soft drugs. And you really can't compartmentalize these things because there's generally a graduation from soft drugs to hard drugs, and there's a sort of a cross-fertilization among the users and the sellers of both of these drugs. So President Johnson in February of this year suggested a reorganization, and he called for more education in the area, more research in the area, and stronger law enforcement. And his feeling was stronger law enforcement would involve the combining of both of these federal agencies, the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control and the Food and Drug Administration, and the Bureau of Narcotics and the U.S. Treasury Department, and making it one single agency with one head. And this has now happened. We received our new director yesterday. His name is Johnny Ingersoll, and he's very strong on education, he's very strong on training, and he's very strong on enforcement. His background is basically, he's a graduate of Berkeley from their graduate school. He's been a student of O.W. Wilson, who was the former police commissioner in Chicago, and former police chief in North Carolina. Former member of the IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And he conducted field surveys for the IACP to beef up and to strengthen local law enforcement departments around the country. So we have a strong feeling that we have a fine director and we're all going to move forward. And I think he has a fine team. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics has 300 working agents on the street. The Bureau of Drug Abuse Control has 300 agents, so this makes a total team of 600. The President has suggested, and I'm not too sure about his suggestion, whether it will go through or not, he has suggested an increase of 200 more people, so this fiscal year, which would mean that we have a total force of 800 people. And I'm not sure if this suggestion will go through or not with the tremendous budget cuts the whole government faces in meeting our current national fiscal problems. But the thrust, I think, of this newly formed agency will not only be enforcement, but it will also give, hopefully, strong support to research and to education. And this is one of the reasons why I'm delighted to be here today. Now, I'm going to talk about marijuana as a hazard. And what I'd like to do is talk to you briefly about marijuana first, show you a few slides that I have, and then discuss what's wrong with marijuana. Because that seems to be one of the current problems these days. Most people are asking, you know, what's so bad about marijuana and why is everybody against it? And I'll give you, hopefully objectively, some facts about marijuana. And these facts are basically medical facts that have been gleaned from medical testimony. And hopefully by getting these facts and putting all of the facts together and all the things you do know about drug abuse, and hopefully going out and collecting more facts, because more and more facts are being fed into the system, that when you're asked questions or you have your own thoughts on the whole drug abuse problem, you'll have a strong base to build on, and from it, hopefully, do some good communicating so that the people who may become involved in drug abuse can make intelligent decisions about what they should do about the drug abuse problem. Now, the technical name of the plant from which all marijuana preparations are derived is Cannabis sativa L, and it's sometimes called Cannabis indica, Indian hemp, or simply hemp. Now, the cannabis plant is native to large areas of the world, and its fibers have been used for the manufacture of twine, rope, bags, cloth, and paper. The sterilized seeds are occasionally used in bird seed. Some extracts are used in making paint products. It has been used in the past for a variety of disorders. It's been used as an analgesic. It's been used as a poultice for corns. And it's been used in other ways, but the medical uses were found to be either unsound or inefficient or without predictable effect. So it's been removed from the United States pharmacopoeia as well as official drug lists from nearly all countries. I think France is still using marijuana in medical preparations, and basically it's used as a poultice or a corn remover. There is, however, a great deal of research, medical research going into it, because it may be possible that it would have some good therapeutic functions. There are some things going on in the Near East, and I think it's not in the Near East, but in Europe. In Czechoslovakia, there is a team of scientists hopefully finding some uses for marijuana as a help in skin disorders, as an antibacterial agent. There's another group in Princeton, New Jersey, who are also involved in research of the rosins and the content of marijuana to determine if some legitimate medical use can be found. But again, at the moment, there are no medical uses for it. Now, under the federal law, marijuana is defined to mean all parts of the cannabis plant except for the stalks and the sterilized seeds. All other preparations of the plant, whether of leaves or flowers or rosins or chemical extracts, they're all various forms of marijuana. The best known of these is hashish, which is a concentrated preparation of marijuana, and I'll show you the slide in a moment with hashish. In this country, the term marijuana usually refers to the pulverized leaves and flowering top of the plant, and it's called pot or grass, or they have 100 different names on the street, but these are probably the most familiar terms and ones generally used. And it's used for smoking in homemade cigarettes. Sometimes it's used by smoking in pipes, and it's generally the cigarettes are generally called reefers or sticks or joints. We now know that marijuana contains a number of potent drug compounds called, it's a rather long name, tetrahydrocannabinols, and I'll write it on the board in a moment as soon as I see how it's spelled. It's a pretty long word. Tetrahydrocannabinol. And since it is such a long word, the people who have found this chemical compound which gives marijuana its strength, to make it a little easier to talk about, they call it THC. And rather than try to keep talking about tetrahydrocannabinol, I'll mention it as THC. Now, the strength of any given preparation of marijuana depends upon the amount of THC which is contained in it. The strongest preparations, such as hashish, are made in certain areas of the world, particularly India and the Near East. A substantial quantity of hashish finds its way into this country's illicit traffic. However, most of the marijuana users in this country are using regular marijuana, not the hashish. The hashish is beginning to flow into San Francisco. It's beginning to flow into New York. And I'd say I'm not too sure of I don't know the exact figures of the numbers of seizures we've made with hashish, but when I was working on the streets in New York, we would run into it about once a year. And that once a year would generally be a shipment from the Near East, brought in by a seaman. The seaman would generally be Greek. He would generally bring it to the Greek neighborhood in New York, and because the Greeks in the old country enjoyed hashish, and there was a very tiny market here in New York City. But today it's a little different. We find it in other cities of the United States, and a number of people other than Greeks are using it. Now, the people using marijuana in this country are basically using it or settling for adulterated forms because we feel that the state and the federal and the local policing activity, plus the general air of social condemnation, makes it difficult and expensive and dangerous to acquire and possess marijuana. And thus American users accept whatever grade of marijuana they can get at whatever price that it is offered and whenever it is available. So they're not locked into any organized crime syndicate in the Near East or any organized crime syndicates here in the United States. It's generally a sort of a local entrepreneur would become involved in the traffic, and sometimes basically for sale for profit, and at other times the giving or transferring of it to its friends at a party. Now, the effects on the mind and body have been chronicled by the World Health Organization, and in a report of 1965, approximately 3 years ago, they came out with a drug dependence report which involves all of the drugs that are involved with drug abuse. And if you're interested in perhaps picking up a copy, and unfortunately I don't have any copies to give out, it's called Drug Dependence, Its Significance and Characteristics. And it's a bulletin of the World Health Organization, and you can write to the United Nations in New York, whom I believe would be able to furnish you with a copy. It's volume 32, 1965. Now, the World Health Organization has quite a bit to say about all of the drugs and the effects of the drugs on the mind and the body. But about marijuana, I've extracted basically their main theme, and it mentions among the more prominent subjective effects of cannabis, which again is a sort of a scientific term really for marijuana, are hilarity, carelessness, loquacious euphoria, distortion of sensation and perception, impairment of judgment and memory, distortion of emotional responsiveness, irritability, and confusion. Other effects which appear after repeated administration, and now we're talking about chronic use, it includes lowering of the sensory threshold, especially for optical and acoustical stimuli, illusions and delusions that predispose to antisocial behavior, anxiety and aggressiveness as a possible result of various intellectual and sensory derangements, and sleep disturbances. So the effects of the drug on the nervous system and brain are undoubtedly profound and constitute a great problem for the user and the persons around them. This may include the precipitation of psychotic episodes during which the user becomes mentally unbalanced for varying periods of time. Now, talking about the psychotic episodes, this is always a problem because in the past they never really had any given substance of marijuana that they could give to a person who was involved in an experiment and record his reactions both on the mind and the body. Because I could pick up marijuana on the streets of New York, as an example, from a peddler and bring it over to the researcher, and he in turn would give it to the user, but you wouldn't know how strong the marijuana was, how old it was, and I presume a number of other factors that would be involved in the strength of the preparation that was being consumed. Now, with the extraction of this THC, which is the main chemical component of the marijuana plant, they now can give dosages to persons of THC and record reactions. And when they give a dosage, they know exactly what the dosage is, and if they have 10 persons, they can give these 10 persons particular dosages and record the effects on the mind and the body. Now, the person who seems to have done most of the work in this, and this is a very recent report, it's in 1967, is a Dr. Harris Isbell, I-S-B-E-L-L. He's on the National Research Council Committee on Problems of Drug Dependence. He was formerly a medical director at Lexington Hospital, where he was involved in treating heroin addicts. At the present time, he's retired from the Public Health Service, and he's at the University of Kentucky. He's chairman of their I believe, their pharmacology section. But he had a long paper that he gave to the National Research Council, and I'll leave the paper up here for anyone who would like to get at least the subject's name. It's called, the subject is called Method of Assay in Human Subjects and Results with Crude Extracts, Purified Tetrahydrocannabinols, and Synthetic Compounds. And again, extracting from his report, he says that it has long been known that marijuana and hashish can cause psychotic reactions, but usually such reactions were ascribed to individual idiosyncrasies rather than being usual or common reaction to the drug. The data in these experiments, however, definitely indicate that the psychotomimetic effects of THC are dependent on dosage, and that sufficiently high doses can cause psychotic reactions in almost any individual. And let me just read that sentence again, because I certainly don't want to mislead you, and there are two key phrases in here. He says that in using THC in the experiments, it's dependent on dosage. Now, if he gives a very small dosage, nothing may happen, but if you give a larger dosage to certain individuals, they'll get a reaction, and if they give larger and larger doses to other individuals, everyone will get a psychotic reaction. Psychotic reactions after smoking marijuana under the usual conditions in the United States appears to be rare, but the low incidence of such psychotic breaks may reflect nothing more than the low tetrahydrocannabinol content of most of the marijuana available in the United States. That's the end of his particular report. Now, those who have studied uses of marijuana have found that excessive indulgence, and this is quoting an Indian authority, his name is Chopra, C-H-O-P-R-A, and he's talking about the Indian experience, and he's really talking about hashish in India, which again is a much stronger preparation than marijuana. Excessive indulgence in cannabis is apt to produce in healthy individuals and more so in susceptible individuals mental confusion, which may lead to delusions with restlessness and disordered movements. Intellectual impairment as well as disorientation may show itself in various ways. Now, prior to the study showing that the THC in appropriate concentration causes psychotic reactions, there had been considerable controversy over the connections between marijuana use and criminality. A recent report of the New York County Medical Society noted that habitual use of hashish, now again, hashish is a much stronger preparation, mostly confined to the Near East, is definitely associated with criminality, violence, and insanity. A sufficient dose of marijuana is capable of producing all of the effects of hashish and even LSD, which is conceded to be one of the most powerful drugs known to man, and this is what Dr. Donald Luria, who was, I think, a respected member of the medical community, he's probably the foremost authority on LSD, and he mentions that a sufficient dose of marijuana is capable of producing all of the effects of hashish and even LSD. So in talking about marijuana and crime, I think it's important to remember that marijuana may not lead to crime itself directly, but if you have a psychotic reaction, and depending upon the circumstances and upon the type of psychosis that's exhibited by the user, he can cause some violence to himself or to other people. So I think it's something to consider, although this is a very difficult area to really prove or disprove. The President's Crime Report has a section on marijuana, and in that particular report, the researchers stated both cases. In other words, that marijuana causes crime and marijuana does not cause crime. And they cited the various authorities, and there are a number of reports citing violence associated with marijuana. And their feeling was, well, you couldn't really prove the thing either way, because although you may have a person who says, well, I just killed my wife, or I just assaulted someone, and the reason I did it was because I smoked a marijuana cigarette, it doesn't mean that that could be a self-serving declaration on the part of the person to hopefully get some consideration from the court because he was intoxicated. Or again, it may be something within the individual that just came on without marijuana. Or again, marijuana could have been the triggering episode that caused it, but the whole area is so loose and so vague, it's really very difficult to mention. And I think this is a valid point, that if marijuana does cause psychosis in large doses, this psychosis could hurt the person himself, or it could hurt the people around him. And in some of the hurting of the people around him, this could involve some criminal act. Now, in talking about the mind, the effects on the mind and the body, I quoted the World Health Organization, but I would like to just read you a short quote from Dr. Henry Brill, who is a psychiatrist that he's in New York City, and he's at, I think, the director of Central Islip Hospital, which is one of the larger mental institutions in New York. He studied the drug abuse problem for many, many years, and in fact, I think this is his main kick as a psychiatrist. And he is now a member of the board of the New York State Narcotic Commission. So again, he's a respected member of the medical community, and I think what he has to say about marijuana, you might note mentally at least. He says marijuana is very active oh boy. Someone help me on that one? Pharmacologically. I'm blocked completely. The mental effects are, of course, very marked. Emotional balance is disturbed, and waves of euphoria are often interspersed with phases of anxiety. In addition, paranoid episodes of greater or less intensity are frequent and can give rise to disturbances of conduct. Volition and initiative are impaired, and a degree of calm lassitude tends to supervene. Sensation is changed and distorted, and even marijuana smoking, in quotes, American style, can produce full-fledged hallucinations and delusions. When the dose is raised, mental reactions are intensified and are much like those produced by LSD. There are no American data as yet on the effects of long-continued use of potent preparations such as hashish, but such effects are well known from experience in the Middle East and the Orient, and they include vagabondage and chronic psychosis. Marijuana has been called a weak hallucinogen. It is better described as a powerful hallucinogen in dilute form. If marijuana is made universally available, a lot of people will get into serious trouble. He has some other, I think, some very helpful things to say, and he mentions the entanglement of drug taking with psychiatry is a very complex one. For the individual, the best advice seems to be, if you really feel driven to take a drug for its mental effects, then you are the kind of individual that shouldn't have it. The population who are vulnerable to drugs can best be identified by their overwhelming and unconquerable drive to get something with which to become intoxicated. They are the ones most likely to travel all the way along the road that leads them down and out. They disappear from view in the schools as dropouts, but appear elsewhere as drug casualties. Private mental hospitals throughout the country have had a striking inflow of such cases for the last few years. And again, although this paper is basically on marijuana, what I read to you about drug taking is drug taking and not just confined, I believe, to marijuana. Let me show you some slides on this marijuana. Before I continue, I would like to talk a little bit about marijuana and alcohol, and I'd also like to talk about marijuana and its relationship to addiction. But I think you might have a better view of what marijuana is by a few slides that I'd like to show you. That's what they say, but I don't see anything happening. No. Is it coming down? Oh, I'm looking at this thing here, no wonder. Okay. No. All right, in the upper portion of the picture is a marijuana leaf, and it's encased in some sort of plastic. It would be much greener than this on the bush. On the right-hand side is the marijuana that is called manicured because they take out the seeds and the roots and the twigs and what have you. So when you get just the leaves and the flowering tops and the removal of this extraneous material, the man on the street would call it manicured, and he pays a higher price for it. And on the left-hand side is some marijuana cigarettes, which look pretty beefy. Generally, they're rather loosely packed and pretty slim. These look like the man who was rolling them up rolled up some pretty heavy ones. May I have the next slide, please? Someone at the training school handed me these slides and mentioned to me that at our training school he's growing for research purposes marijuana, and this particular slide shows the marijuana plant at 5 days old. You see at the bottom the seed, and on the left and right hand side the flower of the leaf of marijuana coming out. May I have the next slide? This is the marijuana now at 15 days old, and it's about 4.5 inches high, and it's beginning to take on the characteristics of the regular marijuana plant. May I have the next slide? I'm not too sure how old this plant is, but it's probably about a month old. And I might mention this is a very hardy weed. If you had some seed and you threw it outside here at Ford University on the grass, it would probably grow. There have been stories about it growing even on the concrete streets of New York, as long as there was a little dirt along the cracks. So it's a very hardy weed that can withstand heat and doesn't need a lot of moisture. Most of it is grown, the type that the American user likes to use is Mexican grown because it has a higher rosin content, it has more kick to it and more punch. But many people settle for the domestic variety that can be grown here in the United States anywhere. But we have a problem with it in the Midwest, and here in Indiana there is some growth in irrigation ditches, along highways and farmers' fields and so forth. But it's basically wild growth. And again, the user who's using this stuff will generally pick up the Mexican variety, which comes over in rather large quantities across the Mexican border. To identify the marijuana plant for the botanist in the crowd, the leaves are generally odd in number. They're usually 7 leaves or 9 leaves or 11 leaves or 13 leaves on a particular stem. And at harvesting time, if you felt underneath it, you'd feel a very sticky rosin or sap. And the top of the leaf would have little tiny hairs, which they call sistole of hairs, which you can't see with the naked eye if you look real carefully, but you could probably do better looking at it with the microscope. And it has a serrated edge, very much like a saw-toothed. And I think this picture would generally give you a good idea of what a marijuana plant looks like. Next slide, please. Again, a young plant. This is probably about 3 feet high. Most of the plants in Mexico, as an example, grow 5 or 6 feet. Some grow as high as 8 feet. People have told me they've grown as high as this room, depending upon the climate and the enforcement situation and what have you. Next slide, please. I think that's a good example of a full-grown marijuana plant. Next slide. Again, this would be a full-grown marijuana plant. Next slide. This is a chart that they use at the training school, which I think is interesting because it points up, number one on the left, that there are commercial uses for marijuana. It's used as rope, paint or varnish, fertilizer, or birdseed. And there are some complex marijuana mixtures where it's mixed with water or with alcohol, or in some countries it's mixed with other substances, and it's either eaten, or it's drunk, or it's smoked. And on the right-hand side, they have quite a few names that are found around the world. In France, chanvre. There's some names I never really heard of. I'm trying to see some words that are familiar. Tukuri in Tunisia and Keef in Algeria. These are fairly common terms. But in the United States, generally weed or pot or grass is generally what it's referred to. Again, when we're talking about all of these substances, American-style marijuana or cannabis indica or hashish, we're talking about this cannabis sativa L, all the same plant. Next slide, please. Some shots of the male flower and the female flower and the leaf. And basically, the grower is supposed to be crushing the leaves and flowering tops of the female plant, but the human nature being, because supposedly that has a greater potency for marijuana, knowing human nature, if male flowers are around there, they go into the pot too. But generally, the female flower is that which gives it its potency. Are there any more slides? But this is after the worker goes out in the field, takes it down, and they dry it out, and then when it's dry, they crush it and mix it into, well, they really put it in burlap bags in Mexico and take it across the border, and it's eventually rolled and wrapped here in the United States. Next slide. Again, some more marijuana with the seeds on the left. Next slide. Different seizures of marijuana. It may have come in the mail. Quite often they sell it by the tin or the can. They sell it by the matchbox. They sell it by the cigarette. I think that completes the slide. And I'm wrong. This is brick marijuana. It was bought in Detroit, Michigan. The chemist reports the brick has been dampened with sugar syrup and pressed into the form. And this is 1965, but I think before that, the Mexican producers were using brick forms to press the marijuana, so it would come to the United States in the form of bricks, and generally it would be about the size of a building brick, and it would cost, I think, about $25 a kilo, which is 2.2 pounds. And on the other side of the border would cost about 100, and then of course the profits mount as it's cut down into smaller quantities and sold. A kilo of marijuana, you could make approximately 2,500 cigarettes, and if you were in an area where they're selling for $1 a stick or $1 a cigarette, that'd be $2,500, so it wouldn't be too bad a profit for the risk that you take. Next slide, please. Now this is hashish. This, I believe, is Lebanese because in Lebanon they have some country there that is very productive as far as marijuana is concerned. They've got a lot of heat from the United Nations in the past few years, where the United Nations in their councils would tell Lebanon, well, you know, you're the producers of hashish that flow all over the Near East, and you should do something about it. So they are doing something about it. They're now reducing their marijuana fields and planting sunflower seeds. And according to reports from Lebanese economists, they're making as much money on sunflower seeds as they do with hashish. This you can take or leave. You know, I'm not too sure as far as actual profits are concerned. But in the United Nations, there is a tremendous drive for crop substitution with opium and other dangerous drugs to substitute other crops, and Iran has gone along this route, and they've done a very effective job, and we're hoping other countries will, particularly those in the Far East. This is what they call a slipper of hashish. They call it a pantufel. It's a very dark, gummy brown substance, and highly potent. It has a lot of THC in it, and they've had some very bad experiences in the Near East with this hashish. Thank you. Let me rush through a bit because I see time is beginning to run along, but I would like to mention this marijuana and alcohol controversy, because a lot of kids say, well, you know, what's so bad about marijuana? It doesn't give you a hangover, and you don't get all slopped over like you would with alcohol, and I prefer smoking marijuana. And I think what they forget is that alcoholism is a major social problem in the United States, and adding marijuana to alcohol, or marijuana problem to the alcohol problem, is really additive. We'd have a greater social problem. I think the kids are inclined to forget with alcohol is that even though it's socially accepted in the United States, it is a problem. We have 5 million alcoholics in the United States. If they have a family of 4 people, it might affect 20 million people in the United States. We have 24,000 automobile fatalities in the United States each year. I think that was the latest figure on fatalities that were directly related to alcohol. In law enforcement, in the crime report, they mentioned of 6 million arrests in 1967, 2 million of them were directly related to alcohol. So this equation with alcohol is not basically a good equation, and there is some other material on alcohol. If you'll bear with me a moment, because I think it's fairly important. The Council on Mental Health, which is the Council of the American Medical Association, and the National Research Council came out with a paper, and this is a 1968 paper. It came out in June, was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, June 24th, 1968. And they mention cannabis is a dangerous drug, and as such is a public health concern. And I'd like to mention that briefly about their particular statement. But on alcohol, they mention, when advocates of legalizing marijuana claim that it is less harmful than alcohol, they are actually comparing the relatively insignificant effects of marijuana at the lower end of the dose-response curve with the effects of alcohol at the toxicity end of the curve. That is, the spree use of marijuana versus acute or chronic poisoning with alcohol. If they compared both drugs at the upper end of the curve, they would see that the effects on the individual and society are highly deleterious in both cases. Admittedly, if alcohol could be removed from the reach of alcoholics, one of the larger medical and social problems could be solved. But to make the active preparations of cannabis generally available would solve nothing. Instead, it would create a comparable problem of major proportions. In talking about cannabis as a dangerous drug of public health concern, they mentioned the Isbell study that I mentioned to you previously, where with the extraction of THC and giving it in experimentation, they found that it does produce a psychotic effect. And I'm not being fair to the authors of this thing, because they may have been thinking of Isbell, but they don't exactly say this. Let me tell you what they did say about cannabis is a dangerous drug. Although dose-response curves... Now, let me read another paragraph. Some of the components of the natural resins obtained from the hemp plant are powerful psychoactive agents. Hence, the resins themselves may be. In dogs and monkeys, they have produced complete anesthesia of several days' duration with quantities of less than 10 milligrams. Although dose-response curves are not so accurately defined in man, the order of potency on a weight milligram basis are greater than those for many of the other powerful psychoactive agents, such as the barbiturates. They are markedly greater than those for alcohol. In many countries where chronic heavy use of cannabis occurs, such as Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria, it has a marked effect of reducing the social productivity of a significant number of persons. The fact that no physical dependence develops with cannabis does not mean that it is an innocuous drug. Many stimulants are dangerous psychoactive substances, although they do not cause physical dependence. And later on in the report, they ask for more research and more educational programs. I would like to spend just a couple of minutes on marijuana and addiction, because again, there is always some real heavy thoughts on this, and really a lot of controversy on does marijuana, and you have to be a little careful with words, does marijuana lead to heroin use? Or does marijuana use cause heroin usage? In a nutshell, if you smoke a marijuana cigarette and you continue to smoke it, and you smoked it for 40 or 50 years, there would be nothing in your marijuana smoking as such that would lead you to the use of heroin. But there have been studies made, and I think some very good studies, of heroin users, heroin addicts. And they asked these people at Lexington Hospital and Fort Worth Hospital, this is where the addict centers are, what did you start with before you started using heroin? And a Dr. Ball down there studied 2,213 addicts. And he reported that 70% of them had used marijuana prior to their addiction. And he then studied 1,759 of these addicts in those areas where marijuana was available. And he found that 80% had first used marijuana. Now, there's another psychiatrist who has done some work in this field. His name is Dr. Chappell from London. And he studied 80 English addicts, and he found that 70 of them had started with marijuana and proceeded to heroin. So I think your next thought should be, well, it may be very true that marijuana was the beginning drug and they eventually used heroin, But this doesn't prove that marijuana was the thing that started them on heroin. And it's very true. I think all you can say is that of all of the heroin addicts we know, that a large percentage of them started with marijuana. There's another study in New York by a Dr. Shine from New York University. He studied 93 kids, Negro kids from New York City, and he found 86% of them started with marijuana. Now, I think what you can say is that of the heroin users we know, most of them started with marijuana. And then I think the rejoinder would be, well, how many marijuana smokers smoked and never went on to heroin? And there's a recent study in California, and I'm not that familiar with the study that I could give you exact data on it, but it is by the state of California on marijuana usage. And in 1962, they studied 400 users of marijuana. They collected the records, they interviewed the kids, and 5 years later they studied them again. And of the 400 kids, and it's 400 and something kids, 50% of them never used marijuana again. And this was after a period of 5 years. In other words, at that 50-year period, they were not using marijuana or any other illicit drug. And in 38% of the cases, they found that the kids were still using marijuana, and they were also using other drugs, such as the amphetamines, which would be methadone, or speed as they call it, which is a very dangerous drug, by the way, and some other amphetamines. So they were still involved in drug usage, again in that soft drug scale, if you want to call any of these drugs soft. But 12% of these kids, 12% of the 400, had proceeded to heroin. Now, I think you'd have to know the study, and I'd have to know the study more, because this was quoted to me by a psychiatrist whom I met in Detroit, who was doing a lot of work in this field, and he was pretty excited about the figures. And the feeling is that if even 10% of these marijuana smokers proceeded to heroin, you could have a real problem on your hands. So I think the main point is that there is a relationship with marijuana and heroin. A view of this, and I'm inclined to agree with the view, is that once a kid gets involved in this drug culture, once he begins experimenting with marijuana and he stays with it, and many of them give it up immediately, but if they stay with it, they'll start reaching out for other drugs. They'll start reaching out for the amphetamines. They'll start reaching out for the barbiturates. They'll start reaching out for the LSD. They'll start reaching out for the methadone. The methadone is a very short step, I think, to heroin usage, because methadone, you cook it up as you would heroin. You put it into a needle and you shoot it into your arm. And to me, this is a pretty big step for anyone to be fooling around with needles. I don't happen to like needles myself, and I don't think most people do. And so I think it's a big step, this needle business, and I think that methadone step to heroin is to me, a pretty short step. So again, I think becoming involved in the drug culture and not getting away from it, it's sort of getting into quicksand and sinking into the drug culture, and it's very difficult to get out. I see my time is up, and I have a few more notes here and there, but I think I've covered my main points. I did want to bring to your attention the statement of the World Health Organization, which was 1965, the statement of the American Medical Association's Council on Mental Health, coupled with the National Research Council, saying that marijuana is a dangerous drug and it is of public concern. And hopefully along the way I pointed out a couple of other articles that may be of interest to you. I hope you do a lot of reading in this area and get all of the facts you can together and come up with a conclusion. There's a lot of controversy in this area. There is a lot of discussion. I think some of this controversy may be solved with the research that's going on today. But I do think there's an important thing to remember, that I think if the kids are given facts about marijuana and some of the problems that could be caused by it, they may not use marijuana, and they may make an intelligent decision to stay away from the abuse of drugs. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'm now ready for questions.
I have a question on the legal aspect of marijuana use. If a person uses the plant, they run into legal difficulty. I wonder what coverage we have on laws at the present time for the chemical synthesis, let's say in a lab situation of THC, and then more importantly, the use of that compound, not grown from the plant, synthesized in the lab.
Right. There has been a lot of discussion I'd say the last year when the THC was recognized. Number one is the chemical component and the realization that it might be made synthetically. What laws would cover it? The present laws do not cover it under the Marijuana Act. It's the natural plant that we're talking about under our law. But there has been an amendment to the drug abuse law. There has been an amendment to the drug abuse law that does cover synthetic compounds.
Does that amendment now cover THC?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
How much collaboration do we get from the Mexican government when that is brought into the United States?
For many years, we've had some real problems with our border situation because the real problem here is that this is very profitable merchandise. And the Mexican government at least as far as the border was concerned, and our people on the border, the customs people, have been working very closely together. We opened up an office about 3 years ago in Mexico City. We have two agents down there working directly with the Mexican Judicial Police. They're working with them mainly in undercover work. Our American agents will go in and negotiate with the producers and the sellers, and when they deliver the drugs, the Mexican Judicial Police will arrest them. But this is pretty tough work as far as trying to solve an entire problem. So the Mexican government and the United States government have had in the past and are continuing to have a series of conversations about how to solve this problem. The Mexican government has opened up a campaign against opium, which they also grow down there, and the marijuana, where they destroy the fields mainly by sending in soldiers and police by helicopter in these mountainous areas, and they actually uproot and burn this thing. To show, I think, that, and again, it depends really on the government how strong a thrust you'll make on this. And I think the Mexicans are making a good effort. I think in the last 2 years they've lost 7 judicial policemen in gunfights with these marijuana peddlers and heroin peddlers. So I think it's an indication that the Mexican government is trying to do something about it. It takes a long time in high circles, and eventually it filters down.
Well, we've also heard that quite a bit of the marijuana is coming from Vietnam. What has been done to curb this?
Well, we're having a problem in Vietnam where marijuana is available. It's basically grown in a province south of Saigon, and again, they get some tremendous profits by selling it to the troops. A number of our troops, and I don't think it's as great a number as has been indicated by John Steinbeck as an example. And I'm not too sure what figures he used, but it sounded like the whole military force was turned on over in Vietnam. But there are a number of kids using it over there. And I think it was Mr. Schiller mentioned, I came in on the question and answer period, and he was talking about tension and anxiety. And I think this is maybe part of the problem of the military kids who are using marijuana over there. The military government is trying to handle this problem on a number of fronts, but their most important front is a combined joint program in the Department of Defense on education here in the States and also overseas on the whole problem of drug abuse, because it also covers other drugs such as opium in Vietnam.
Well, especially thinking about the boys that bring it back with them.
Another problem, and they not only bring it back, but I think this is tightening up, and I don't think too many of them are bringing it back. Some are mailing it back, and this is tightening up. So customs and the military have tightened the procedures so that in the past, when a kid came back for rest and recreation, their main concern was get him back to Hawaii or to the States and let him relax and soften the procedures at the border, because the border situation or the port situation is much tighter. And I think they're cutting down tremendously on this shipment of packages to the States.
They are arguing that if marijuana was legalized, then they wouldn't be coming in contact with these pieces. Has there been any research done on whether when the user of marijuana comes in contact with these pieces, are they asking for the harder drugs, or are the pieces encouraging this?
No, I think there are a lot of folk tales really that are really just recently developed, because this is not an old problem in the United States. It starts back really during the Civil War. But the folklore, I think, in enforcement anyway, and I think it's spread outward, is that there is always some kid in the black cloak or a man in a black cloak who is luring these kids into drug addiction. And this never happens, very, very seldom happens. What generally happens is a kid in the classroom or a kid at a party who's smoking pot or using drugs, and he turns his best friend on, either a boyfriend or a girlfriend, because he wants to share what he thinks is truly a wonderful experience to him. So I don't think, as far as a profit motive, the legalization of marijuana would cure anything, because I don't think that's the route the traffic takes. It's mainly association with other people and the spreading of drug abuse among basically friends.
I'm sorry, we're out of time, and Mr. O'Carroll, as well as Mr. Schilling, will have lunch with us. Any of those that would like to join us, we expect you further. We'll recess now until 1 o'clock. Thank you.